Shosky with Van Eck, and thank you for joining our webinar today. The AI energy trade is nuclear. There have been countless headlines in the last year to a year and a half focused on the explosion in electricity demand, driven primarily from huge tech investment into the AI energy ecosystem, namely the infrastructure that's needed to support the massive spending and the massive AI models that are the next wave of technological innovation. And with that has come a major focus on how we are going to meet that electricity demand moving forward with all of the competing drivers of innovation that need this electricity. Nuclear power, nuclear energy has fit very starkly right in the middle of this conversation, and it's driven quite a bit of interest in the space from both a policy and corporate perspective, but also from an investment perspective. And we hope today to cover many of those catalysts that have driven nuclear to be one of the most highly discussed topics when it comes to the AI energy trade. And with me today is Coulter Riegel, my colleague from Van Eck, and we hope to cover various topics today, ranging from how investors can gain exposure to this investment trend in a very well thought out, comprehensive way. In addition, we'll talk about many of the catalysts that have driven the advancement of discussion around nuclear, from rising electricity demand to the nature and profile that nuclear energy offers to the consumer, those that need electricity from a corporate, commercial, and residential perspective. And of course, all of that has culminated with widespread policy adoption, which has been yet another catalyst for the nuclear energy ecosystem. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Coulter. You can talk a little bit about electricity demand, which is really forefront in this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brandon. And I think this is a great slide. So before we dive into why nuclear makes sense, maybe we take a step back and I think just talk about the demand for electricity, and where many are seeing that going, because really ultimately that's sort of what has brought much of this conversation to the forefront today is this demand for electricity, particularly from new technologies like artificial intelligence. And so that's kind of where we'll start. AI has really sort of burst onto the scene here in the last 2-3 years, and it really has kind of taken over many of the narratives that are out there in the market. And beyond AI is the infrastructure that goes on behind it that is required to facilitate the sort of step function up in this new technology. And one of that is data centers. And so across the country and really globally, we're seeing increasing demand for AI, data center infrastructure, and the power that's required to fuel these data centers in order to facilitate the AI technology going forward. So, if you look back just a few years, really data centers are kind of a stagnant and kind of budding center of the electricity demand market. But going forward, it's increasingly becoming a larger and larger part of this demand for electricity, specifically for clean electricity, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I just want to kind of highlight the fact that at the forefront of electricity demand is AI. That's a big driver of the current demand for electricity. And increasingly, we're seeing AI tap into that and expand that beyond just typical data centers. So, I think one thing to kind of highlight as well is that while AI is really sort of at the forefront of this conversation in terms of what's powering demand for electricity, there are many other facets that are actually even largely, contributing to demand for electricity just well beyond AI and data centers. And so if you take a kind of a step back and you think about globally where the world is, we're seeing increasingly number of the population of the world kind of begin to enter the middle class market of consumerism. So they're getting access to things like refrigeration and AC. And so I'm down here in Florida actually, and so it's quite hot during the July and August summers, and so we have quite a bit of AC going. And I imagine up many parts of the world that's quite similar, especially in Asia, where we're seeing large cohorts of the population, gain access to that. So space cooling, appliances, and also another big part of the demand for electricity is sort of the advent of the transition from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. So that's a big part of the demand for electricity going forward as well. And then also, I think importantly enough, beyond just the electricity to power AI in the data centers. I think the technologies that AI technology will unlock, things like robotics and industry automation, increasingly going forward will all be big drivers of electricity. So while AI is at the forefront of the demand for electricity and in much of people's conversations, I think it's also important to note that there are many other demand drivers as well that go beyond just data centers that are really increasing the demand for electricity or expected to going forward. And so how does nuclear fit into that conversation? I think the demand for electricity is evident. It's really the question is, well, okay, how do you get that demand and where do you provide, what technologies can we use to provide that electricity? And I think that's where nuclear really does kind of fall in and makes a perfect fit within this conversation.
That's right, Coulter. And just to put electricity demand into perspective, because you highlighted, I mean, there's AI is front and center. That's what everyone's talking about. But there are so many other sources of electricity demand, and they're all competing, right? I mean, there's so much innovation happening right now. It's exponential. AI is clearly transformative, and it's going to fuel the future of many different aspects of technological innovation. But you're also competing with longer term trends that are well into their kind of mature stages, like cloud computing. That requires massive server capacity and electricity. Electric vehicles, you mentioned, that's a slowing but a continued trend, and that's going to cause, require more electricity. Other topics that have been front and center with some of the U.S. trade policy is the kind of the re-domesticating or the domestic manufacturing process that's expected to grow here in the U.S. That's just going to require more electricity. And last year in 2024, we saw global electricity demand increase by over 4% annually. And that's a pretty notable jump. The IEA has those projections continuing through 2027. And to put that into context, we had about 2 decades of fairly stagnant electricity demand growth. We have to go all the way back to the dot-com bubble and the adoption of the internet widely, where massive server build out was required to sustain that trend, to find a period where we're seeing such significant electricity demand growth. So where do governments and corporations go when they know they must compete for electricity, particularly as these projections are increasing seemingly every month into the future? Well, many, particularly led by large tech companies, have turned to nuclear. And that's why nuclear is in this renaissance period right now. It's being led by the private industry, by corporations, big tech companies like Meta, Amazon, Google, all investing significantly in their energy supply chain. And nuclear fits very, very, very prominently in that conversation. And the reason is that nuclear has this combination of efficiency and clean energy profile. So the emissions profile associated with nuclear is actually lower than even other renewable energy sources like solar and geothermal. So from a total emissions perspective, nuclear very much stands out. And that's very attractive to not only governments and other policy organizations that are targeting lowering their overall emissions, but also big tech companies that have made many, many climate pledges over the years and are trying to reduce their carbon footprint. So nuclear very much fits in the conversation for big tech companies from an emissions perspective, but it has the added benefit of a very efficient high capacity factor. So you think about the low carbon energy sources we have available to us today, think of solar, think of wind. These are all intermittent power sources. So the sun goes down at night, there are cloudy days, and the wind patterns can change very regularly. So the availability of that baseload power supply can be very intermittent with those power sources. Nuclear, even compared to traditional fossil fuels, has a much higher capacity factor, meaning for all of the possible times that it can be producing power, over 93% of the time, nuclear power facilities are producing baseload power. That's important because traditional fuel sources and power, I should say energy sources like natural gas and coal, there are significant maintenance cycles and periods when facilities might be down for maintenance. And of course, there's issues and problems that can cause downtime as well. So when you have a fuel source, an energy source that has this combination of, low emissions paired with very reliable electricity availability for data centers that are running 24/7, fueling these AI models and other cloud-based software. It becomes very attractive for corporations and governments, and that's really the probably the next major catalyst for nuclear. Many countries moved away from nuclear power following the Fukushima natural disaster in 2011 in Japan. Japan, of course, moved away from nuclear power reactors. European developed countries very much embraced other renewable energy sources and all but abandoned nuclear, with the exception of some countries like France. The US went through a period of decommissioning of nuclear power facilities here in the States. And nuclear was all but left behind when it came to global energy policy. However, in the last several years, as corporations have led with investment in nuclear, and governments have re-embraced nuclear technology, as particularly advanced nuclear technology, which we'll touch on in a moment, we've seen a sea change here. There's been a major shift in policy support. Western countries are re-embracing nuclear. They're abandoning their commitments to decommission power plants. They're now considering, it's amazing, we've gone from decommissioning conversations to extending the life conversations of existing reactors and recommissioning conversations. And now suddenly in the United States, we're talking about building new nuclear reactors, not something that most people could probably imagine maybe 5 years ago. So there's been major policy support growing, and it can only be, the least of which I should say would be the Trump administration executive orders from earlier this year in May 2025. These executive orders were really the culmination of a series of support out of the United States, in which the Trump administration committed to seeking to quadruple our nuclear energy capacity here in the United States by 2050. Many other countries globally have committed to tripling nuclear capacity by 2050. And of course, the Trump administration, not to be outdone, has targeted quadrupling. They're also trying to reduce the regulatory timeline associated with building a nuclear reactor, particularly on the advanced reactor technology side. And it also included directives for the U.S. military to house small modular reactors, these advanced nuclear reactor technologies, on military installations here in the States as well. So there's been a ton of catalysts ranging from growing electricity demand, investment from big tech, and also policy support that continues. And we continue to see major catalysts seemingly every week, if not every month or so. And we expect to see those moving forward. But I would say it's not all about one-off catalysts or new news that comes to the market. There have been massive investment in nuclear globally for well over a decade. Just might have happened in other parts of the world. Coulter, let's talk about the one country you cannot not talk about when you're talking.
Absolutely. And before I jump onto that thread, I just one more point I think that's important to highlight as regards to sort of regulatory catalysts. I think one big thing that stands out with nuclear that is sort of not very common is that the support for nuclear is from both sides of the aisle here in the U.S. and I think really globally. So it's not many topics that you can get agreements on both sides of the aisle. And nuclear is one of those few topics. It was actually the Advanced Act, which was passed by the Biden administration in July of last year. That was actually passed in the Senate by a vote of 88-2 essentially. So, and even the House, you saw 300, almost 400 votes, in favor of this pro-nuclear regulatory, act. So I think that's one important thing to highlight. So you're getting, support from both sides of the aisle in agreement that this is technology and this is a way to deliver clean, reliable, and affordable energy, going forward. But beyond just within the U.S., this really is, a global trend. It's not just, the United States looking into this technology. While the U.S. is and still remains for now, the world's largest producer of electricity from nuclear sources. There are many other countries, particularly China, that have really leaned into this technology and are putting it as sort of a main feature of their future plans for electricity growth demand. Within China currently, they're actually building nearly 30 reactors, or planning to build at least 30 reactors that are currently under construction. If you look at the U.S., Brandon sort of mentioned a little bit, we sort of had a 2 or 3 decade period in the U.S. where we just really stopped producing any sort of new construction as it relates to nuclear facilities. So it was just our first reactors in the last 30 years just came online a couple of years ago, and that's with the Vogtle 3 and Vogtle 4 reactor in Georgia. Prior to that, it really was 25, 30 years since our last nuclear reactor was built. Now, conversely, if you look at China, as I mentioned, they're actually building about 30 currently now, and they have plans for, I think, at least another 30 or 40 in the future. So this is technology that they're really leaning into, and they're doing it fast and cheap. And I think the U.S. there's sort of an adversarial relationship here with the U.S. and China. Obviously, you see it quite a bit in sort of these chip restrictions that the current administration here in the U.S. is sort of placing in regards to AI chips being sold to China. I think power goes sort of hand in hand with that, obviously, and I think administrators here and regulators in the U.S. are seeing the massive support that China is giving nuclear and the nuclear industry over there, and they're recognizing that and seeing that we're falling behind a bit. So I think that's partially what's driving a little bit of this, the haste and the catalyst that we're seeing in relation to nuclear. But it's certainly a big topic to kind of point out. But I would also point out, beyond just China, you're seeing many other, burgeoning economies that are out there globally really lean into the support of nuclear. So India is another big one. India is number 2 in terms of, current nuclear reactors that are under construction today. And so you're seeing it sort of across the board. And even most recently, within the EU, Germany had sort of always been sort of the anti-nuclear stalwart. Even just recently, within the last couple of months, they've sort of reversed their stance a bit. They're not quite pro-nuclear yet, I would say, but I think they've agreed at least to not, hamstring nuclear development within the EU, today. So you're seeing increasingly, more and more support, particularly globally, for this technology, and you're seeing it, in action in terms of, number of reactors that are currently under construction.
Thanks, Coulter. So we've got major catalysts that have driven nuclear in the last, 2 years, 3 years plus. That's increasing electricity demand. Our world is electrifying. There clearly needs to be a mix of power sources. There are clear beneficiaries of that, whether it's natural gas in the near term, nuclear in the near and intermediate term, or even long term. But that's because nuclear provides this clean and reliable power, which has caught the attention of global policymakers, or I should say, recaught the attention of global policymakers, all driving demand and investment opportunity, importantly, within the nuclear ecosystem. So that's what we want to talk about now, are the opportunities for investment in the uranium and nuclear space. And at VanEck, we very much believe in the entire value chain. So it's an ecosystem, nuclear power and nuclear energy. And it starts upstream with the companies that are extracting and processing uranium for use by the power producers, the utilities downstream that are generating electricity and delivering them to end users, both residential and commercial uses. In between, there's a very interesting opportunity set. It had long been a bit of an overlooked area of the nuclear energy ecosystem. These industrials companies, many of which have a long history of engineering and nuclear power plant maintenance, whether that be decommissioning services, maybe even recommissioning services, and maintenance and various engineering activities. But there's also an emerging segment of this market that has been focused on the very innovative, growth-oriented opportunities within the nuclear energy ecosystem, and that is those companies that are focused on next generation advanced reactor technology or small modular reactors. And those are the companies that you may be familiar with, from NuScale, ticker symbol SMR for small modular reactor, straight through to a company like Oklo that has kind of a hybrid utility model generating a small modular advanced reactor and also planning to distribute that power. Straight through to nano nuclear energy, which is developing micro reactors the size of a tractor trailer or smaller, all of which offer great potential and opportunity for further development as the nuclear ecosystem evolves. These small modular reactors are just that. They're small. The footprint is much smaller than a traditional nuclear power facility, and they're modular. So they can be manufactured offsite and then brought on site and assembled, reducing the lead time for construction, and reducing overall costs related to nuclear power facility build out. These are still in development. There are many that are competing to be first to market in this small modular reactor space. It's a very innovative space, but it's also been a very slow moving space until recently. There's approximately 80 different small modular reactor models that are being developed from pure play companies like I mentioned, NuScale and Oklo, straight through to large defense type organizations that are also developing small modular reactors, several of which are also held in the portfolio of our ETF, the VanEck Uranium and Nuclear ETF, ticker NLR. So we very much believe in a diversified, comprehensive approach to investing in the nuclear energy opportunity set, and we do so in a pure play way. That's really important to us here at VanEck, and the underlying index that is used by our NLR ETF seeks to identify companies that are principally engaged in the value chain that I just detailed. So companies that are generating at least 50% of their revenue from the uranium and nuclear activities across the value chain. That's really important. If you think about a downstream utility, for example, one that is heavily involved in nuclear and is widely associated with the nuclear energy trade. But if you peel back layers of the onion, you might learn that some of these utility companies are just the nuclear portion of their overall business is a very small percentage. High-flying names like Vistra Energy and GE Vernova, very much focused on nuclear and other renewable energies. But a company like Vistra Energy, for example, which has been very, very closely tied to the data center trade, only generates about 15% of their total electricity supply from nuclear. The majority is natural gas produced. So we think it's very important to understand a trend, identify that trend and why it makes sense for investors, but then provide direct exposure to that trend and not water down the exposure by including ancillary companies that may be associated with a particular trend, but in practice generate quite a bit of their revenue elsewhere. So pure play is extremely important for us when we think about investing in this space, in addition to the comprehensive nature of investing in the nuclear energy ecosystem. And you can't talk about investing in nuclear without acknowledging the risks that are associated with it, something that all investors, depending, regardless of whether this is a very strategic, significant exposure in your portfolio because of a deep belief in the future of nuclear, or if it's an opportunistic kind of tactical small allocation within a growth portion of your portfolio, you should always be aware of the risks that underlie any investment, particularly nuclear. Of course, the uranium side of the exposure within our ETF NLR, as well as the broad market, is susceptible to commodity price risk. Cyclicality is common for uranium miners. They're very much susceptible to supply and demand trends. And then, of course, regulatory risk is very important. We talked about many of the catalysts that have happened in the last several years from a global policy support perspective. But, following a human or natural disaster, you're always subject to risk that these countries, governments may pull back support from nuclear. So always being aware of the overall regulatory environment is very important. So I've talked a lot about the various kind of opportunities within nuclear energy, we tend to prefer comprehensive exposure because you're getting built-in diversification, and you can still maintain meaningful exposure to each area of the nuclear energy ecosystem. But by and large, historically, you tend to gain that exposure with a more attractive risk reward profile. So, Coulter, we've talked quite a bit with investors on this topic. Risk, downside risk, volatility. Many investors, as a first foray into the uranium and nuclear market, have looked to uranium because there are many investment opportunities focused purely on uranium, which I, talked about being upstream, cyclical. So what have we found? Maybe walk us through the benefits of the comprehensive approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're incredibly, accurate when you mention that. Typically when people think of the nuclear market and how to access it, historically it has really been through primarily exposure of just uranium and really uranium mining companies. And these are obviously very cyclical, areas of the market that can, be whipsawed around. So I think if in this top chart here, you can look to the right and you'll see calendar year returns for some of these products. So in the top line we have the index underlying RETF and LR, and it's that's providing the comprehensive exposure that provides exposure to the nuclear, utilities, the industrials, as well as the uranium miners. And then below that, it's just an index that tracks uranium mining only, which historically has been what most people have sort of associated with this market. And if you look at in years like 2020, 2021, you see big up years, but then, you see big crashes as well. So in 19 and 22, and even last year, while much of the overall nuclear market was up, uranium miners were actually down quite a bit. So it's this volatility, and cyclicality, nature of uranium and the miners that operate within that sort of commodity driven segment, really can drive quite a bit of volatility. And so we found that, having a more comprehensive exposure and approach, one that includes things like utilities, that can really help act as a ballast to sort of that volatility that you typically see within the uranium market. And so by doing so, you still get very attractive returns and actually better risk-adjusted returns. So on the bottom chart here, we've got 3-year returns in risk metrics. So you're actually getting, over the last 3 years, even higher returns than you would just typically in a pure uranium exposure product, with lower volatility and lower max drawdown. So, the cyclicality nature and the boom bust, of the uranium market is something to certainly be aware of. And our view is that, it makes sense from an investment perspective to take a more holistic and comprehensive, approach and include things beyond just uranium. So that would be obviously the utility companies that Brandon has mentioned, but also the industrials that are really sort of at the forefront of this new reactor technology, such as SMRs. So by including the whole universe and value chain of nuclear, you're getting a more modest approach that can help limit some of the volatility of uranium. And also you're gaining exposure to sort of these new emerging areas like SMRs, which really sort of just burst onto the scene here in the last couple of years. A product that is more comprehensive would capture these like, the index underlies NLR, and gain exposure to those sort of new and emerging trends within even just, a segment such as nuclear. And so that's really, our view is that, taking a holistic approach can give you better risk-adjusted returns and better access to sort of emerging trends, particularly in a market like today where you're seeing such rapid pace of regulatory policy, corporate investment. It really is quite hard to sort of, pick and choose the areas of a specific market. And so the approach of gaining a broad, comprehensive, exposure to that is really what we feel is most appropriate.
Thanks, Coulter. Maybe just to tie a bow in this conversation so that we can jump to questions. We are not new to the nuclear energy and uranium space. VanEck has a very long-term view, trying to identify trends in the marketplace and offer those exposure to those long-term structural trends to investors. So while many of you or other your peers in the market may have started to look into nuclear in recent months or years, VanEck didn't launch a product just to tap into a short-term trend. This is very much in our mind a long-term energy allocation. And we launched our ETF NLR back in 2007, which I think puts a little bit of proof behind that position here at VanEck. So this isn't a flash in the pan type of ETF that we launched based on some investor interest. We very much have believed in exposure to this long-term trend. Of course, it's fluctuated in terms of policy support and performance over the years, but we've always wanted to provide exposure to the entire opportunity set. And I think that's very important, allowing investors to gain exposure meaningfully to all areas of the nuclear energy ecosystem to capitalize on these long-term structural trends that we're talking about today. The growing electricity demand that we're seeing from massive tech investment and innovation that has attracted corporations to invest in nuclear for its clean and reliable characteristics, and of course, has led to widespread policy support. So if you ever want to learn more about our investment strategy, NLR, or our views as a firm on the nuclear and energy ecosystem, I very much encourage you to visit vaneck.com. That's VANECK.com/subscribe. Try to get on our lists because we try to put out some great content and keep you apprised of developments in the markets, specifically on nuclear, as it becomes such a timely topic for investors. Okay, I think we did it. Did a pretty good job. We pulled together our content in 30 minutes because we wanted to provide plenty of time to answer your questions. I've already seen a few questions come into the Q&A window. If you have a question you'd like us to discuss, please submit it now in the question and answer pop-up window in your webinar module. And we're going to take a stab at answering everything because there's been some good questions coming in so far. We did get a few questions submitted along with the registration process in advance of the webinar. So let's tackle some of those first, Coulter. And I'm going to toss this one to you because you were talking a little bit about the risk-reward profile of a comprehensive exposure of a comprehensive approach and looking beyond just uranium, but seeing as uranium is a significant part of the overall market. We had a question submitted on uranium prices. So uranium prices are well below the 2024 peak. Can the miners stand to benefit at current prices? Anything you'd mention there? We do have a slide on prices I'll pull up.
Yeah, we do have a slide. If you could show that for me. Yeah, that's a great question because it really is, while we do, there are other areas of the market, uranium and the miners that operate within nuclear segment, they really do make up quite a significant portion of the overall market. So, the relationship of miners and their profitability, compared to prices of uranium really is quite a unique one and an important one, in fact. But this chart here is really, I think, very helpful in terms of context. So, while uranium prices today are still, a little bit below sort of the peak about a year ago or so, where we saw sort of a large spike in price of uranium go, from, call it $40, $50 a pound, doubling to, about 100 or slightly over. We've seen it kind of come down from there. But, today we're around 70 to $80 a pound. So we're below the peak of last year, but we're still certainly well above the prices from even just if you go back 3, 4, 5 years ago, you'll see uranium prices that were sort of in the $30 to $40 range per pound. So, the price of uranium today is still significantly higher than it was, just 5 years ago. And I think part of that really kind of comes with the nature of commodity, markets. It really is tied to supply and demand. As prices go up, you'll see new sources of supply come online, and as prices fall, it becomes less, economically viable to operate these mines, and so you'll see supply, fall. But I think the longer term, projections show that the demand for uranium going forward into the next, 2-3 decades, is at this present point, looking like it will probably outstrip the supply of uranium, that we're seeing going forward. So, I think the higher prices will certainly help incentivize, new supply to come online, more mines, and that should, certainly, help with the supply demand aspect of it. But I think for the majority of the, next decade or so, I think you're likely to see, probably relatively elevated or, prices of uranium. And I think tying into that also is, today currently, and this wasn't necessarily part of the question, but much of the supply of uranium actually comes from areas like Russia, And so there's been a big drive to try and build and incentivize more domestic sources of uranium and enrich uranium. Um, so that's a big part of what we're seeing in sort of the regulatory acts and policy support over the last year from the current administration, is to try and incentivize that development of the uranium supply chain within domestic or more Western European nations. And so I think going forward, you'll certainly see supply increase, but I think there also is a very large outlay of expected demand for uranium. So prices for uranium, I think, will probably remain above the $30 to $40 price marks that we saw 5 years ago or so.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Coulter. We've gotten a couple questions that I'm going to try to group together to some degree. And maybe I'm gonna read a question submitted by Richard, and this one will help, I think, answer a couple of these questions that we received in. So, nuclear, of course, makes a lot of sense in the world for fueling the AI data center megatrend. However, it takes many years to build big new nuclear plants, and SMRs appear to be a 2030 and beyond phenomenon. So, as a long-term investment, nuclear makes sense. What is the best way for investors to take advantage of the bridge to the nuclear build out, I should say? Natural gas producers and providers seem to be an obvious current choice for now till 2030. Are there other bridges to the nuclear plays that stand out? I'm going to maybe talk about a few things here, because the perception is it just takes a long time to build nuclear facilities, and that's true. As Coulter highlighted, the last nuclear power reactors built in the U.S. were the Vogtle reactors down in Georgia. Those were long overdue projects that went over budget, and a lot of that has to do with regulatory issues that they ran into, among other reasons. But I would say we think of the nuclear opportunity set in phases. So there are short-term opportunities within nuclear that we're seeing play out today. There's all other intermediate term opportunities and then long term. So let's start on the short term. One very simple and short term solution to increasing energy capacity from nuclear is to extend the regulatory life of an existing nuclear power facility. Again, a regulatory process, but there are regulatory lives associated with nuclear power reactors. They are probably the most regulated power source here in the United States. So a simple extension of that regulatory life can help increase future capacity from nuclear. And that's happening in real time. We're seeing that play out with various facilities over the last several years. A big news item from a month or two ago was that Meta signed long-term power purchase agreements with Constellation Energy, which will allow Constellation Energy to work with local and national regulators in Illinois to fund and make feasible the extension of the Clinton nuclear power facility in Illinois. So that's an example of private tech investment, so not public government investment, but a corporation committing to purchase power from a nuclear facility for about 20 years into the future, allowing local utilities to extend the life of a facility that may otherwise have economically not been viable. So that's the short-term opportunity in nuclear, is the extension of regulatory life. And then short to intermediate term, there's the recommissioning of existing power facilities. So something like 3 Mile Island, that caught a lot of attention with the Microsoft Constellation Energy announcement last year. There's other facilities in Michigan, the Palisades nuclear power reactor, that can be brought back online much quicker than it would ever take to build a new facility. So there are recommissioning opportunities as well. And then longer term, we're actually, like I said at one point earlier, we're actually in the conversation of building nuclear reactors again, which just was not on the table in the past. Let's keep small modular reactors, which I'll touch on in a moment, out of the conversation. We've gotten announcements out of New York, a state that not that long ago decommissioned a nuclear power reactor just outside of Manhattan, the Indian Point nuclear power facility. We're suddenly hearing from the governor of New York that that there's consideration to build a new nuclear facility, traditional nuclear power facility. And that doesn't stop there. Texas, a lot of news came out of Texas with the massive data capability that they're trying to build out of Texas to build nuclear power reactors and add reactor capacity to existing nuclear power facilities. So there are long-term opportunities, and really the conversation around the long-term opportunities have been around small modular reactors. So I'll touch on that briefly. Coulter, jump in when I finish because
Yeah.
you have some more thoughts. But the executive orders from Trump very much tried to address technological advancement because, as Coulter alluded to earlier, we're in a bit of a race, right? We don't want to come in second place with innovation, and that applies to AI, chips, and advanced nuclear technology. So the executive orders reduced the regulatory burdens, forcing the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission here in the United States, to rule on reactor licensing within 18 months, which is a shorter timeline than it ever typically takes when dealing with the NRC. And it's also directing, the Department of Defense to locate small modular reactors on nuclear power facilities. So a company like Oklo, which is in our ETF, OKLO, they caught a lot of attention when news broke that they were being considered to locate a small modular reactor, their Aurora power facility at a Air Force base in Alaska. So there's a lot of new developments from a regulatory perspective that may expedite that timeline. There are companies that are targeting as early as 2027 to have commercially viable small modular reactors available. Those timelines consistently move. The goalposts are moving. So reasonable investors would probably take a cautious approach to being too optimistic when it comes to when these things will be, be scalable. But I do think that timeline has sped up compared to the past. Coulter, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I would just add, I think one interesting point to sort of as a bridge from sort of where we are today to where we want to be in the next couple of years is, I think, within the current nuclear utility facilities. One of the things, and is actually, I think, mentioned in one of the current administration's nuclear executive orders, is to actually target increased amounts of uprating, which essentially is just taking the current reactors that we have today that are at the nuclear facilities and enhancing them to provide an extra 5, 10, 15% electricity output. So there are plenty of reactors that we have here in the U.S. already today that could handle some upgrades and higher output rates. So that's certainly one item that's been sort of mentioned within the executive orders, specifically, is to incentivize some more of these uprates and to produce more power from the reactors that we have already today. And then I would also add that many of the nuclear facilities we have actually have capacity for an additional reactor or two. Most of these facilities can handle 4 reactors, for example, and many might have 1 or 2. And that's what I think in Georgia was one example of that, where there was already sort of a facility in place with 2 reactors, and they added 2 more. I mean, granted, those were the first reactors that we built in about 30 years, so there were some cost overruns and some delays. But I would also point to somebody like China. China has taken this approach where they're building sort of the same blueprint and reactor plan many times over, and so they've gotten it down to where they've got a streamlined construction and development process where they can build a large scale reactor in 3-4 years for a very cost effective way. And so while the U.S. is sort of behind the ball a little bit because we've sort of let our experience and workforce atrophy a bit over the last couple of decades, I think there's immense support from both corporations and regulators to incentivize that to change. And so I would expect that trend to continue. And my hope is that we can see more large scale reactors as well as the newer smaller reactors, which have really cool implications as well. But I think we'll see both of those really sort of continue to advance at a pretty rapid pace.
I have a few questions. I'll take these, Coulter, because they're more product related. So, but then we'll come back to some other interesting industry stuff that I want to get your take on. We had a question from Brady and Matt that kind of have to do with how the ETF and underlying index works, um, as well as John. So Brady, John, and Matt are asking about how our ETF works. One is about exposure. So Matt asks, are there other countries oh, I'm sorry, not Matt. Got that one wrong. Oh, the question is, how frequently are new candidates for the index considered? For example, some of the major European players are not included. There's also a question about the sector exposure. So what is, from Brad or Brady, what is the purpose for overweight miners versus industrials, with industrials outperforming in the current cycle? And then John asked, curious whether SRUUF is included in NLR. That's the Sprott Uranium Trust, Physical Uranium Trust. So maybe I'll touch on all of those. First of all, how does the index work? The index is very simple and straightforward. It's passive, so this is not an active strategy. There are no subjective decisions being made when allocating to certain companies or sectors. The index simply assesses the global equity market and identifies those that it believes to be pure play uranium and nuclear companies. And by pure play, we mean that a company must generate at least 50% of their revenue from these predefined activities in order to qualify for addition into the index. Once those companies are identified, then they're weighted by their free float market capitalization. So free float meaning the shares that are freely available to trade in the market, and those are weighted by size essentially. And there are individual caps on individual companies to ensure diversification is met within the portfolio. There's an 8% cap on any individual company. But there are no minimums or maximums from a sector perspective. The index is meant to be truly representative of the opportunity set. So, as observed regarding the by Brady with miners versus industrials exposure, the market caps will dictate the weighting and the size within the portfolio. So as small modular reactor companies grow in size, if they do, or if new companies come to market and IPO, for example, that exposure within the portfolio can grow. Historically, utilities, because they tend to be larger, stable companies, have had a larger weighting in our portfolio, but we've seen miners appreciate in size over the last 5 or 6 years. And then the industrial segment has grown significantly. So it's meant to evolve with the ecosystem, and that's what we hope to see over time. And then lastly, we do not include the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust in the underlying index. The index is really meant to capture equity exposure to the space, and that being more of a commodity investment vehicle. The index provider has never targeted that particular vehicle. Not to say that investors don't seek out physical uranium exposure. I understand the appeal of that. In fact, many of the ETFs in the marketplace that target uranium miners added Sprott Physical Uranium Trust to their portfolios. Some of them did as uranium prices peaked, to be perfectly honest, but we kind of resisted chasing that trend, and we wanted to stick with how we've constructed this index over time. Coulter, I want to come to you on the topic of, not that you're an expert on uranium recycling, but we've looked a lot into your recycling of uranium, and I think a lot of folks would be surprised by a few things. One, uranium fuel, enriched uranium, can be used for quite a while in a nuclear reactor. And then two, a lot of the new advanced reactor technologies are making the idea of using your recycled uranium even more and more feasible in the future. Do you want to touch on kind of how uranium recycling fits into this conversation?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's a big part of the conversation that, you're already seeing quite a bit of recycling of spent uranium fuel in places like France. I think about 10 to 15% of their current nuclear fuel is actually just from recycled sources. In the US, we actually don't recycle any of our uranium fuel, but I think there's probably some support to change that going forward, because ultimately, as I mentioned earlier on sort of that slide talking about the supply and demand characteristics, and there's sort of a expected structural deficit of uranium going forward in certain periods. So one area that we could look to help meet that demand, and as well as help reduce some of the waste from our current reactors, is to actually reprocess spent uranium fuel. So, as you mentioned, reactors can actually operate off the same uranium fuel rods for several years before needing to be refueled. And then even after, refueling the spent fuel, even after say 5 years, in a reactor, it actually has still 90% of its energy potential left in the fuel itself. It just takes some reprocessing and recycling of that material in order to prepare it to go back into a reactor. And so while we don't do that today currently in the U.S., we do stockpile and have stockpiled all of our uranium fuel since the early 50s, when commercial nuclear facilities first sort of came onto the scene. And there was actually a study by the Department of Defense that showed that estimated if we were to recycle all of our currently stockpiled spent fuel, we'd have enough uranium fuel for the next 100 years almost. So there is really a lot of potential there. It might take some development in order to be able to fully utilize that at a cost-effective manner, but it certainly is an option that I think we'll see probably increase going forward. And then to your point, the newer sort of next generation of reactors use they're actually designed largely to use this recycled fuel, which can have a little bit of a higher uranium enrichment capacity, which gives it longer lifespan and higher output. And so some of these new reactors are expected to be able to use the same sort of high assay recycled uranium fuel for several decades before needing to actually be recycled. So we're seeing recycling currently in places like France, and I think we'll probably see that here at some point in the U.S. as well, since it is a very large opportunity to provide ourselves self-sufficient uranium fuel, as well as it's always good to recycle potential waste and reuse that in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Coulter. We had a question from Mark Hu about small modular reactors. They're clearly getting a lot of attention. We talked a little bit about the timeline and uncertainty around the timeline, but the tailwinds and deregulatory trends that may help expedite timelines. So the question was, how much growth is expected there? Who are the most promising players? And I'll take it from a kind of a public markets perspective, and then there's of course a private market angle to all of this, because many of these companies are still private. But when we look at our ETF and its underlying index, pure play small modular reactor or advanced reactor companies are not, there aren't that many in the public markets right now. But there's been a pretty exponential growth in the last 2 years in terms of the exposure within our portfolio. So there's a company, NuScale, under the ticker SMR. They're actually the only SMR company with a NRC regulatory license. They still need other licenses, but they've got a design license for their reactor technology that was just actually upsized from a gigawatt perspective by the NRC. So NuScale has been kind of the longest existing publicly traded pure play, and they were joined through some de-SPACing activity in the last year or two by Oklo, which has caught a lot of attention because it's a Sam Altman-backed company, and it also had Chris Wright, the current energy secretary, on the board prior to his nomination and confirmation as energy secretary. And then there's Nano Nuclear Energy, which is a micro reactor pure play. So that's one segment of the market, these pure play public companies. And then there's also quite a few public companies that are very much involved in small modular reactor technology. We have a company, BWX Technologies, in our portfolio. It's a 100-year-old company that's been heavily focused on nuclear over the years. They're one of the 80 or so models trying to come to market. And then there's other larger conglomerates in the industrial segment that are very much involved in small modular reactor technology. Companies like Rolls-Royce, the defense company, other large Korean engineering firms that are involved in SMR technology. The problem from our perspective with looking to those companies is that they're very much engaged in other activities beyond nuclear and beyond small modular reactors in particular. So while they may be at the leading edge of SMR development, they might only have the potential to generate small portions of their overall revenue from that activity. So we tend to avoid non-pure play names within our portfolio. And then the other exciting space that we hope will become part of our ETF's exposure in the coming years are the many private companies that are very well funded, have had support from major players in the industry, if not large tech company investment. And we'll see where they go. They're all racing to develop their SMR technology and get that to scale. Those include the likes of X Energy, a company that was planning to de-SPAC and become a publicly traded company and pulled back from those plans a year or two ago. Terra Power, which is the Bill Gates supported small modular reactor company. Kairos is a name that we've seen associated with a lot of the big tech companies in recent time, with different investment from these tech players, both equity and from power purchase agreements. So there's a lot of really interesting companies, Deep Fission and others, that are at different phases of the timeline. I've been a little long-worded on this response, but the last thing I will say when it comes to these SMRs is it tends to be two parts of the equation at the highest level in terms of the resistance or the friction in order to get to market. There's the funding side, and then of course the regulatory side. There's positive developments on the regulatory side with this kind of deregulation posture that the executive orders introduced that we've talked about. But from a funding side perspective, there are many very well-funded small modular reactor companies. Like I said, when Bill Gates is in the mix, that can change the equation for some companies. But we've seen major investment, like 500 million Series D or Series E investment from the likes of Microsoft and Amazon and Google and companies like that are investing not only in buying power from SMRs, but equity investment stakes in these companies, because clearly they want to have reliable power moving forward for all of their capital expenditure initiatives. All right, Coulter. We probably have time for one more. I'll take a quick stab at this one, chime in, because this touches at another macro theme that we talked about. But Jim asked, is Germany likely to revive nuclear program? That was a really interesting development earlier this year from the European Union, which has long, as an organization, resisted the classification of nuclear as clean or green, which has kind of prevented nuclear from access to various tax credits and funding incentives within the European Union. There's always been a general internal battle between France, which is very supportive of nuclear. Coulter touched on them already, and Germany, which was resistant, and others. Germany effectively stood down, I would say, from their resistance, and has essentially opened the door for nuclear to be considered clean, green energy source under European Union regulations. So that's a European Union development and potentially positive for nuclear in Europe. But from a German perspective, they decommissioned all of their nuclear power facilities. They have several sitting unused, and depending on where things go with Russia, Ukraine peace talks, they could still find themselves in this energy uncertainty as they struggle with their energy policy in light of the events of the last several years. So I could certainly see in the future Germany reevaluating their approach and potentially looking to nuclear once again. Any other thoughts broadly on that topic, Coulter?
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think, we've sort of mentioned it a couple times, but very briefly, or on the fringes of other topics, is the sort of energy security aspect of nuclear. And I think that's a topic that over the last couple of years, given sort of the increasing global conflict that we've seen, particularly in Europe, between Russia and Ukraine, there is quite a large reliance in Europe on oil and natural gas from Russia. And, whether the talks, between Ukraine and Russia, result in positive, an outcome, I think regardless of that, I think it's the last couple of years have highlighted, sort of a critical vulnerability of Europe in where they source their energy from. And I think that's on the minds of, many regulators as well as many, residents, of those countries as they're going through sort of heat waves, over there, and um, more and more are accessing and using things like air conditioning, and electricity is, rising in terms of cost, and lowering in terms of accessibility. So, it really is sort of a point that really has been sort of thrusted here, I think, to the forefront of many people's minds. And so, regardless of the outcome of the peace talks, I think that's an element that many will continue to think about going forward. I think nuclear plays a big role in how, nations and countries can sort of gain their own energy independence.
Excellent. Thank you, Coulter. Thank you for a lot of your perspective. I know you've been covering this space very intimately over the last 2 years plus. Um, uh, I thank you all for attending. I know that everyone is very busy to carve out 30 to what turned into 60 minutes of your day. We appreciate your interest. Hopefully, we added some value to your day, and we helped answer some questions, if not spur some new ones for you to look into. We are available. We are always here. I'm blown away by the number of questions we got in during this session. Engagement is not always the norm when we're hosting various webinars on differing topics, but this is clearly something that's at the forefront of investors' minds. So for those that we did not answer your question, my apologies. We'll try to reach out directly with you to get you an answer to what you posed in the Q&A window. But with that, again, I encourage you all to visit vanek.com/subscribe, get on our distribution list, and you can read really interesting developments in the nuclear energy ecosystem and see how things evolve and not only for nuclear, but various investment themes across our complex. So thank you all again for attending. With that, today's webinar concludes.